Mike, welcome.
Good to see you. Yeah. Let's take a look, huh?
I spoke with David from the museum, which has been in development since 2018 and is expected to open to the public in 2021.
I've been primarily in nonprofit management, and marketing and PR and development. I, at some point, caught wind of this project coming together. And at the time, just some of the future founding board members were starting to put together the resources for this museum. And it's just an amazing opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity to not only build something like this, but to be able to reach and affect people's perceptions of, the Chinese American story, which I think is very important. My family is from Xiamen, and but my father's born and raised in the Philippines. It's a pretty large Chinese population in Manila. And I'm half Italian. My mother is a Brooklyn Italian. And you grow up being Hapa like that, you don't necessarily have as strong a connection to your ethnic background. But later in life, you kind of start to really appreciate all of the experiences and the inputs into your own life that come from all parts of you. And when we talk about Chinese in America, Chinese Americans, there's not really one monolith description of Chinese Americans. You have Chinese in America that have been here for 5 generations. And then you have recent newcomers, from the mainland or from other parts of the Chinese diaspora. And they all have very different perceptions and understanding of Chinese American history, if at all. And I think that the Chinese that are more recent immigrants, I think that they are a little bit more forward-facing in terms of their Chinese American experience. I think that they don't really look at the past history as much, whereas the Chinese, particularly on the West Coast, that have been here, maybe going on 6 generations now, they're a lot more involved with the telling of those stories. And I think that my own father, who came here in 1968, he is really steeped in Chinese history. He could tell you the details of many dynasties going way back, but he really is not that familiar himself with Chinese American history. I think it's only until recently when I've been sort of feeding it his way. But I think there's an appreciation of the toils, struggles, and achievements of Chinese in this country that I think once people understand it and hear it, it's fascinating, it's inspirational, and it really helps you, like I said earlier, helps you understand the entire American story. That's one of the things we're trying to do as a museum. We don't want, yes, we are a niche museum telling a particular part of American history, but we want to present the Chinese American story as not something that's adjunct to American history, but part of it.
Born in New York City, David attended the College of William and Mary. It's the second oldest higher education institution in the U.S. This is where he received a Bachelor of Arts in both Fine Arts and Art History and a master's degree in Business Administration.
You've got a lot to choose to put in here, what goes in, what stays out. Talk to us about the whole decision-making process and how you put something like this together.
Yeah, it's not a straight line in terms of how you develop it. It's a lot of push and pull. There is a lot of core history about the Chinese American experience that we are obligated in our role to tell. But there's just a lot of community stories and personal stories that we really want to convey to the people that touch this museum, because that's what we really feel like we need the most in these times. We really need people that don't know a lot of Chinese Americans or don't know about the Chinese American story to just take a pause and get to know, fellow Americans. And, we may be able to overcome certain perceptions that people have about Chinese in America. One of them being is that, they're perpetual foreigners or they're newcomers to this land. And part of that story that we're telling is that Chinese in America, we've been here for quite some time, really from the beginning of this country's history. And there have been major contributions to this country by Chinese in America.
Well, talking about the history of this country, in some respects, built on the backs of Chinese Americans.
Absolutely.
Talk to us about that.
Sure. And, we, as a museum too, we really want people to, as part of their takeaway of what they learn here at the museum or through our programs and events, is that we're not just talking about the Chinese American story in a way, we're talking about all immigrant stories. And by understanding and getting exposure to the stories that we're telling, then there's just this opportunity to have a better understanding of Irish Americans and Muslim Americans. And it's part of a continuum that is not just, in one particular category. Most people don't really know a lot about Chinese American history, including Chinese Americans themselves. And one of the things that we're trying to convey is that there is just a history of discrimination and challenges that Chinese Americans have faced. So most people know Chinese in America as being involved with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Perhaps maybe that they came here early on to be part of the gold rush. But beyond that, most people don't realize that some of those early labor stories really led up to legalized exclusion on behalf of the United States in the form of the 1882 Exclusion Act, which really barred and prohibited Chinese from entering this country and becoming citizens for almost 80 years. So in 1882, the Exclusion Act was put in place, signed by Chester Arthur, who actually, to his credit, tried to fight the passing of that law. But just it was overcome by the pressure of the times. And in 1943, the United States rescinded on paper the Chinese Exclusion Act, primarily because they wanted China to be an ally in World War II. But it really was more of a token gesture, because at that time, in 1943, that only allowed for 105 Chinese, 105, not 105,000, but 105 Chinese to immigrate to this country every year. So, that kind of barrier to entry continued on really all the way up until 1965 with the Civil Rights Act.
In the 1850s, more than 20,000 Chinese immigrants came to San Francisco to join the California Gold Rush. And in 1882, although they made up less than 1% of the nation's population, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It suspended Chinese immigration and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. The act wasn't repealed until 1943.
We've had stories on where, kids don't really know their parents' story because of the fear associated with the Chinese Exclusion Act and whether they were here legally or illegally. What are some of the words you would use to describe this great story?
The aspect of the Chinese American story that's probably most overlooked is the fact that it's indelible. It's an indelible part of American history. And it's not something that just appears here and there. The exclusion in the early American history reduced the numbers of Chinese in this country. But I don't think it really reduced the impact, because there are people that are carrying on a legacy of Chinese in America that, I don't think that this country would be where it is, without it.
I think about your dad coming here in '68.
By himself.
By himself.
Yeah.
And there's so many of those kinds of stories too. What's it going to be like to kind of stroll around the museum and kind of show this off to him?
Like I said earlier, my father knows so much about Chinese history. I think it will be a nice turn of the table to tell him stories and point out histories that he's not that familiar with.
What about the sense that you and I are sitting here and we've got this all displayed, and yet you still have a pandemic that's really kind of barring people from walking through here? Are you just chomping at the bit right now, or?
Yes and no. I think this is a good time for us, because a good timing in terms of when this, not that there's a positive aspect of the pandemic, but we are still a museum in development. And if you really think about it, all museums are constantly in development. But one thing this pandemic has done for us is it's really accelerated our adaptation of technology. And I think this is probably true for most museums and maybe cultural organizations. But, we're having digital events that are, have 800 people registered. You'd be hard pressed to have an event at a museum, a museum of modest size, with 800 people. And I think what we've learned is we want to, and it was always part of our plan, but we want to really put more emphasis on building a hybrid museum so that everything we do here physically, whether it's an exhibit or special exhibit or an event, we want to have a digital component of it. So we can reach people on the West Coast, in Australia, in China, or throughout the world, and really it makes the storytelling quite unlimited.
It's kind of forced you to kind of think outside the box, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The advance on the Jap-held monastery for a final mop-up.
Generations of Asian Americans have served in the U.S. military. Today, the Department of Defense says they account for more than 4.5% of active duty military personnel. Nationwide, Asians make up almost 6% of the total U.S. population. It's so interesting looking at some of these, the richness of Chinatowns and Chinese laundry. And, we've talked about the railroad some, but there's some other layers to the American story that the Chinese Americans have brought as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the areas that we want to focus on in the museum is service to country. Most people don't realize that Chinese have fought in every U.S. conflict since the Civil War. There were actually 50 Chinese that fought in the Civil War.
Wow.
And but most notably, 20,000 Chinese fought in World War II. And at the time, because of exclusion, that represented 1 in 4 Chinese men of fighting age.
Wow.
And of those men, 40% of them were barred from being citizens.
Jeez.
Because of exclusion.
Wow.
The footage you're about to see is graphic. During the pandemic in the U.S., there was a rise in racist attacks against Asian Americans. Now, the federal government is taking steps to end the violence.
You stupid.
Okay.
The Justice Department is reviewing ways to better crack down on these types of assaults.
Go to your own country, dreamer.
I was talking to a colleague of mine about the anti-Asian sentiment that's out there, and especially since senior citizens have been targets in so many different locations. And she was talking about the concerns, about her parents, elderly parents, but then she was also talking about her daughter. And I know you've got youngsters, a 16 and a 13-year-old, and a lot of that has to play in your head as well, I imagine. The concerns, the worries about your parents, but then also, what kind of world are we going to leave for our teenagers growing up, and what kind of things are they going to have to deal with?
Yeah.
So if you could be the eavesdropper and tag along with people as they come through here, and they stop here and they make it all the way up, and then as they're exiting the door, what are some things you think you're likely to hear on the way in, and how might the perceptions change as they're leaving and kind of sharing stories about their experience here?
Sure. It'll be interesting because, we do live in this town of incredible monumental museums. This museum will never be able to compete on scale, but I hope that it has, equally significant impact on people's viewpoints. And, like I said earlier, we hope that they're sort of forever changed by their visit here. And then we hope that they become part of this museum's community, because we have an ongoing conversation and, experience that we're still trying to build, that goes way beyond their visit. But I hope that it's less about those details of history and more about just the contributions and the place and the importance of not only understanding the Chinese American story, but understanding all stories that comprise the American history continuum. And I think that's that brings us back full circle to these times, the anti-Asian sentiment, the racial strife that we're seeing. The more we understand about each other, the more we understand that we're all in this together. I think that's helping us move forward.
Do you think that perhaps it can shape another generation of historians, where they take another look and say, hey, maybe we need to devote more time to this, so that people do have a better understanding?
Yeah, I think that working with schools to get this in the curriculum, it can't be understood and it can't be appreciated if it's not ever mentioned. It is truly an underrepresented history. And again, it's my hope that if you can champion one underrepresented history, then the other underrepresented histories can also follow too. You're not just fighting the good fight for your own history that you're telling, but you want to bring everything together, because that's how it all makes sense, the American story.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.